Alleviating poverty has been a goal of the United States ever since the launch of the War on Poverty in the 1960s. But what if the way we think about and talk about poverty is all wrong?
I do think we should have a safety net, but we need to be very careful at how we design it so that we're not inadvertently discouraging people from relying on earnings and market income to rise above the poverty line.
On this episode, we explore how to elevate the nation's understanding of how to truly measure and address poverty for American families that is better oriented toward actual upward mobility and human flourishing. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking with Kevin Corinth. He's the Deputy Director for the Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also a Senior Fellow for AEI. Previously, he was Staff Director for the Joint Economic Committee in Congress and a former Chief Economist for the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Kevin, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Thanks, Nick. Very pleased to be here.
Kevin, I wanted to talk to you because there's kind of, an ongoing years-long discussion, maybe decades-long discussion about poverty and upward mobility in the United States. And even in recent months, there's been some discussion in Washington, D.C. as they're looking at budget reconciliation and potentially reforming or maybe even cutting some of the social safety net programs. There's just a kind of a rich context of debate and discussion around, just generally speaking, opportunity and social mobility in the country. And so in your role serving as Deputy Director of AEI's center that kind of provides the best national research on this stuff, I wanted to talk through with you some of these elements and maybe equip our listeners with some enhanced ways to think about this kind of stuff. First, I wonder if you could just give us a quick primer for folks who may not be familiar. The AEI's Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility, what is it? What does it do? Why was it created? Why should regular folks care?
Sure. And first of all, it has a very appealing acronym, COSM, C-O-S-M, for Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility. COSM began in the beginning of 2023, so we're a little bit over 2 years old now, founded by our director, Scott Winship, who I've known and respected for a long time. And he brought me on in the deputy role, and we've been rolling. Our main objectives are, one, focused on reducing poverty, which has been a long time focus of researchers at AEI, going back at least to the 1960s. Second objective is, we don't only want to improve material well-being, but we also want to increase upward mobility. So are people who begin at the bottom of the distribution able to move up over time through access to opportunity and through hard work. And then our third major pillar, which is something that's also been associated with AEI, but maybe less prominently talked about elsewhere, is social capital. The extent to which our relationships are healthy, that people aren't just thriving materially, but in their kind of social well-being, kind of broadly defined in terms of their family relationships. So marriage is key with their kids, with their neighbors and communities, faith groups and churches and civil society. So these three ingredients are the main objectives. And, we have scholars doing all types of things, which fall into overlapping buckets. But we think those three key themes are what's really vital to really strengthening the American dream and making us as prosperous of a country as we can be.
I love that framing, Kevin, because it really seems to come down to this idea of thriving, of flourishing. Is that the in a way, kind of the promise of America is, I've mentioned before that I think you can boil it down to the two principles of freedom and opportunity, that we're going to, in America, your rights will be protected, you'll be free, and also you have the opportunity to lead a thriving, flourishing life You have all those opportunities for you to go out and earn that for your own life. So I love that framing of it, especially the second and third pillars. It elevates it in really important ways that I think is refreshing. I want to ask you kind of maybe to dive a little deeper on some of those elements. I mentioned a minute ago that kind of, again, the years-long or decades-long debate about opportunity and upward mobility in this country. And at times that debate has been framed as, well, is the United States really, truly still an upwardly mobile nation? Is it really still the opportunity capital of the world? I'm just curious, where do you come down on that? Is America still the land of opportunity?
We're still upwardly mobile. I think we're still the land of opportunity, and you can see that in different ways. People still flock to America to innovate some of the greatest technology that we have, including up through the AI boom we're seeing today. So we are a land of opportunity. I think we are having some difficulty. I think if you look at trends over time, the extent to which people who grow up at the bottom of the distribution move up, while there is still movement, it's less than it used to be. And there's different estimates out there. There's work by Raj Chetty, a famed Harvard economist, who's tracked these things over time. His claim is it's based on mostly good data. For kids born in 1940, 90% would do better than their parents by the time they turned around 30 years old. Kids born around 1980, 1985, that's only true for about half of kids. Now, I think he's right on the direction. There's some reasons why I think that decline is sort of overstated, so it's not as bad as some would say. But looking at this a number of different ways, there has been an actual decline in the extent to which, if you're born at the bottom, you grow over time, and whether or not you're doing better than your parents. So I think we need to take that seriously. It's not just, I think we're still kind of doing better than other major developed countries, because we have those kind of institutions that promote freedom and opportunity, but certainly we can do a lot better.
Kevin, I want to ask you about that a little bit as well, because the Raj Chetty data, the Opportunity Insights, again, it was kind of, it made a lot of news. It was kind of one of those landmark studies. And actually, a lot of Raj Chetty's work has been cited by folks here in Utah, because a lot of his research identifies Utah and the Salt Lake City metro area in particular as among the best places in the nation still for upward mobility. I think some of it ties into some of the social capital elements you were talking about a minute ago, but I want to drill down a little, and because I think there's a key question of really how we measure, how we define this idea of upward mobility. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Raj Chetty data looked at it in terms of relative mobility, that it basically, if you take the entire nation and divide everyone up into 5 groups, the quintiles, the bottom income, top income, and kind of everything in between, the likelihood of someone moving up, that kind of conception, like I guess, what's the right way to talk about it? Because there's relative mobility and then there's absolute mobility. Am I doing better compared to other Americans, or am I doing better compared to what I was experiencing before? Kind of, is there that absolute mobility? Can you weigh in on that? Help us make sense of the debate and what's the right way to understand and talk about upward mobility.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. You put it very clearly. There's absolute mobility, whether or not you do better than your parents at the same age, just in dollar terms, that you're sort of doing better over time. And then there's relative mobility, which is, are you moving up the distribution? So like if you started at the 10th percentile, when you were a kid and your parent and your family, and then when you grow up, do you move up to a higher percentile? Now, the only way for you to move up in the relative distribution is for someone else to move down. And I don't think that's really like the classic American idea. It's not that those who are poor have to replace those who are rich. The idea is that everybody should be getting better off over time. So from a social science perspective, both are legitimate ways to look at sort of how the distribution of income is changing over time. But in terms of my personal view, and I think what's more consistent with the American idea of opportunity and the American dream, it's absolute mobility. Are you better off than you used to be? Or are you better off than your parents were at a similar age? And if everybody is better off than they used to be, everyone's going to be happy. And it doesn't matter whether you have lots of relative movements where one's moving up and one's moving down. I'm not against that. I mean, it's fine to have relative mobility too. That's great. But what we should be striving for with our public policy, and I think the major part of the debate is absolute mobility. Are people getting better off over time, irregardless of their position in the distribution?
Kevin, that resonates with me a lot because I think of it in those terms as well. Of, my wife and I, we have two little boys. They're very young right now, but of course, as they grow and become men, they'll go and out and leave home and kind of lead their lives. And when I think of them, I think, well, my sincere hope is that when they reach my age, that they will be better off than we are, and so on. I think that's maybe a different way to capture the American dream, kind of as you're describing it. How do we do that, or how do we measure that, or try and accomplish that from a public policy standpoint? Is kind of what I want to talk about. You folks at American Enterprise Institute recently put out a new video with you speaking about this issue. It's an AEI policy lens video called "Poorly Defined: Reforming the Poverty Line." We'll include the link in our show notes. Great video, very well done, very insightful thoughts on this. But I want to touch on a couple of the themes from that, because I think it gets at the heart of this question of, is America upwardly mobile? What public policy do we need to implement to maintain or strengthen that? One of the things that seems to come down to just the very way we even define poverty, how we measure it. I think that this gets at what you're saying of, if absolute upward mobility is, I would tend to agree, that's a better kind of metric to anchor ourselves to. There's a lot of debate in sort of the poverty policy world about how we even measure and define poverty. Without kind of getting too wonky for I guess some of our listeners, can you give us a primer on that debate? Because that seems to be the crux of the issue, how we define it so we know how to help people get out of it.
Yeah, sure. And I think it matters how we measure poverty, just because it is a major criterion under which the success of a society is measured. I mean, if it's not the case that people at the bottom end are getting better off over time, then we're not doing that well as a society. So in terms of how you measure it, I will forgive you of, there are way too many details. And that's actually some of my problems with how we measure poverty, that it's far too complicated for unnecessary reasons. But there's essentially two parts of a poverty measure. One is the poverty line. It's just a dollar value, a poverty threshold. If you have more income than that threshold, then you're no longer poor. And then there's just what you count as income. So do you count, and my argument is you would, and I think most people would suggest you should count all income. So whether you get money from earnings, or from government transfers, or dividends, from other market sources, you should probably count a value for health insurance, because that provides value as well. So if we're going to be tracking whether people are able to, rise above a poverty line, we should include all of their resources. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't care about, which source of income is growing. I mean, I would prefer more of it come from earnings and market income than from government transfers. But in terms of determining whether people are better off over time, we should count all of their income, and then we should compare it to a consistent poverty line that, we increase for inflation over time.
It seemed like the crux of this issue, and you kind of alluded to it just now, really is, have we as a nation actually made real progress fighting poverty? And I'm thinking back to the kind of the launch of the war on poverty with President Johnson, the creation of a lot of the programs that now comprise our modern federal social safety net. But this key question of, have we actually made a difference? And that is kind of an area of debate that, again, in this video from AEI you talk about. I want to read a quick quote that I think helps to capture, again, the crux of this debate. And this is actually from the book The Conservative Heart by Arthur Brooks, where he writes, the poverty rate in 1966 was 14.7%. In 2013, at least $15 trillion later, the poverty rate in the United States of America had fallen all the way to 14.5%. So again, Arthur Brooks in The Conservative Heart, kind of making the point that when you look at the official poverty rate, it has not really changed a whole lot across those span of decades. Can give some context to that? I mean, because that's a common thing that I think I hear from folks on the political right at times, is that, hey, like we've had all these expensive federal government programs. If the official poverty rate hasn't changed a whole lot, are they really doing what they're supposed to do? Can you help give some guidance on that?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that the official poverty measure is a garbage measure. It doesn't include all of the things that we do to help low-income Americans. So especially the types of things that we've been doing over the past few decades. So it does not include any in-kind benefits. So anything like the food stamp program, or SNAP, benefits loaded onto an electronic benefit transfer card that people can use for food. Basically the largest non-medical in-kind transfer we have today, over $100 billion, is not included. It doesn't include any kind of rental housing assistance if people live in public housing or a housing choice voucher. It doesn't even include refundable tax credits, which are huge. For instance, the earned income tax credit is worth about $7,000 a year for a single parent with 2 kids. Those aren't included in the official measure. And the way the poverty line has increased over time is based on a bad inflation measure. So we just don't learn really much of anything from looking at the official poverty rate. And so when you see people claim that we've made no progress on poverty, citing the official poverty measure, those claims are wrong.
So what is the right measure? I mean, how if we say, okay, let's look at the 60s compared to today, how are we doing in terms of poverty? What's a better way, in your view, to measure it and to articulate that progress?
Yeah, so that's something that I've spent a lot of time on, a lot of research, sort of going back to 1963, and this was President Lyndon Johnson declaring the war on poverty, taking his poverty line, just update that over time with inflation, and then just count all of the income that people have, whether it's from market sources or government sources. If you do that, you find a more than 90% reduction in poverty between 1963, which is the year before the war on poverty was declared, and 2019. So that suggests to me that we basically have won Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty based on his own terms, which I don't even think is that big of it shouldn't be a surprise. It's been 60 years since that happened. If we had not seen a major decline in poverty in over 60 years, despite all of the economic growth and innovation and improvements in quality of life that we've seen, that would be a giant scandal. So we shouldn't be surprised. And I wouldn't take that as then saying, oh, there's no longer any poverty today. It's just that the standards change over time. I think the way to think about it is, you start in a baseline year. Lyndon Johnson said 1963 for his baseline. You do track poverty and you see improvements over the next 10, 20, 25 years. At that time, standards changed, and now let's set a new poverty line and a new goal for ourselves, and look how that changes. So I think you just need to constantly use an absolute standard to track progress, but then, over a generation or two, then pick a new goal and see how you do on that new one.
Kevin, I think that's very helpful because you're giving some additional context that often is left out of these conversations about some of the changes that have happened since the initial creation of these programs and other factors that you're alluding to. I want to, I guess, argue a little bit, but in good faith, with the intent of, I think we're going to land at the same place when it comes to upward mobility, because everything I've seen from you guys, again, I think the articulation is sound. I guess my only question is, when when we're talking about, what economists call federal transfer programs, the social safety net, and as you say, rightfully so, we need a way to account for how those programs affect sort of the material circumstances of families in poverty. I wonder if it's just kind of a difference in semantics when it comes to, alleviating poverty or just alleviating temporarily material deprivation. And what I mean by that, maybe to use kind of a hypothetical analogy, if you or I had a friend or relative come to us and say, hey, man, I'm really down on my luck. I lost my job. I'm struggling. I need a place to stay for a little while. And if I said, oh, great, I've got a basement. You can sleep on my couch. Don't worry about it. Eat whatever you want out of the fridge. And if you need some help paying bills, I'm happy to help do that for a little while. If that were the circumstance, I wouldn't then go out and say, hey, I solved poverty for my friend. They're no longer impoverished. I would say, well, no, I'm helping them temporarily while they're kind of in a tough spot. But of course, I want to help them find a job again, get back on their feet, and move toward work-based self-reliance. So I guess the way that I would articulate it is that in terms of the safety net, the modern safety net, alleviating material suffering of impoverished families, we should view that as a huge success because of the various programs that can provide that essential stabilization. But if we look at it, I don't know if latent poverty would be the right term, that were it not for these federal government programs, would these families still be considered impoverished? I guess that's what sometimes feels like a little bit of a disconnect. But I think, again, where we would align is that both of those things still point towards true upward mobility. Any thoughts or pushback on kind of my thoughts there?
Yeah, I would actually agree with both things. So I think it's good to track both, whether people are materially better off over time, regardless of income source. I mean, that's independently a good question. But I think then the follow-up question is, what's been driving that success? And, we have seen a very large increase in transfers from government welfare and other transfer programs since the 1960s. And that's becoming a larger and larger share of people's income. In some of our research, we actually look at what we call the dependency rate. So the share of people who receive at least half of their income from government sources. And we find that between 1967 and 2019, for working age adults, that's more than doubled, right? So we are seeing a concerning rise in dependency on government. And actually in some new work we're doing, which I think is pretty interesting, we're looking at, our current research is really focused on what happened starting in 1963 with the war on poverty. But now we're going back even further to 1939 and asking, okay, what was happening before we had this very large increase in government programs? And actually you saw a big reduction in poverty even before the war on poverty started, suggesting that, maybe some of this expansion in transfers has actually displaced some of the earnings growth that was happening before. And that's not to say we shouldn't have a safety net. I do think we should have a safety net, but we need to be very careful in how we design it so that we're not inadvertently discouraging people from relying on earnings and market income to rise above the poverty line, which I agree is the best way to do it. So just to sum up, I mean, I like measuring poverty based on full income, but I also like measuring whether people can rise above the poverty line using, predominantly their own earnings and market income and being less dependent on government.
Kevin, does that lead to maybe sort of a reorientation across the nation, the way we talk about these issues nationally, to try and focus on, again, when I look at the three pillars from COSM, reducing poverty, increasing upward mobility, and enhancing social capital. From this discussion and from that, it seems to me that we need to reorient the way we talk about these things on a national level to say that the goal of the federal safety net is not simply and solely poverty alleviation or material need alleviation. And I guess that's sometimes where I get concerned with the way people talk about poverty, that we hear, and in fact we've heard it recently in recent years over discussions of expansion of child tax credits and other things like that, well, if poverty only means increasing a family's financial resources by any means necessary, then the folks who argue for things like universal basic income or just expanding transfer programs or having such a generous tax credit that we've quote unquote lifted people above the poverty line just because they were getting more money from the government. Again, if the only thing we care about is just finding any way to put resources in the pockets of families on an ongoing way, that argument would in a certain way make sense, but I don't think that's where most Americans are. That most Americans would view it as, the way that I would articulate it is poverty is not so much not having enough, but it's not earning enough. And so the question then becomes, a true poverty alleviation vision is increasing the earned income of these families such that they are no longer reliant on federal transfer programs, federal programs. I guess, is that right? And if so, is there a way to kind of have that be the new way we talk about this stuff on a national level?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, I also worry a lot about earnings, but I think you even get at this broader question. Even if, like, one, I think we really want to reduce poverty over time. We really want to do it through earnings as opposed to government transfers whenever possible. There's going to be, people who are disabled, elderly. Like, we don't want elderly and disabled people in poverty. But for those who are work capable, we want them working and earning their way above the poverty line. But then there's even this bigger question on social capital. And that ties into this because, one, we care a lot about social capital for its own sake. I think we're doing horribly on social capital. And that to me is the most alarming trend of all. We're doing, I think, well in terms of reducing material hardship. We're doing just so-so in terms of absolute mobility. We're doing really poorly on social capital. That is in decline. If you look at marriage rates, sort of affiliation with churches and religious groups, trust in civil society, all of that's doing really bad, but especially among those with lower incomes. And so if you don't have strong social capital, I mean, that's just bad for you as a human, but it's also bad for you in terms of being able to rise up the ladder in terms of getting a job, and then, getting higher wages and being self-sufficient over time. And there's a lot of research, including from, as you mentioned, from Raj Chetty backing that up. So I worry that social capital is harder to even define, but certainly to measure. It's harder to know what policies we need to focus on to get more of it. But without strong social capital, I mean, I have faith that we can have enough economic growth with the right policies that we're just going to become better off over time and everyone's going to benefit from that growth. And that's good. But without the strong social capital, this is the health of our society, is especially those at the lower end, is not going to be good. And I think we need to spend a lot more time focusing on that part of the equation.
Well, that resonates with me as well, because I think what I interpret as what you're articulating is a broader and also more accurate conception of the American dream. That if you and AEI has done polling, other entities have done polling, but just kind of casually speaking, if you go out and ask folks, what is the American dream to you? Like, what does it mean to say I'm living the American dream? Obviously, financial stability is a part of that. But it's, if someone says, well, I draw a good paycheck and that's it, that's not the full picture of the American dream. It is connection, it's relationships, it's family, it's faith institutions, it's community and civic institutions that also, kind of as you're articulating, sort of have an effect of still bolstering the other things that we maybe typically have measured in terms of financial upward mobility. So it is kind of reciprocal. When you say what we're doing, I like how you kind of ranked it, that reducing material alleviation, we're doing pretty well on that. Increasing upward mobility, there's still some work to do there. And then social capital, it's like, man, we are not doing well as a country on that. Can you expand on that a little? Where are we failing on the social capital front? I know you said it's tough to come up with solutions, but is there anything that does come to mind? Maybe anything that COSM is working on to try and pull back that decline on social capital?
Sure, yeah, and I think there's just multiple dimensions of social capital. And like you said, this is really tied up in what people say they care about when it comes to the American dream. So if you take family is the number one thing. If you ask people, what are the most essential elements of the American dream? Something like 80-something% say strong families. And so that to me is like the fundamental building block of society is the family. And that's where you can see just measurable declines over time, particularly with marriage rates and single parenthood, which increased a lot up until the mid 90s. Actually, then welfare reform happened and may have helped to sort of stabilize it. But we're seeing really we've seen a breakdown of the family, which is concerning, especially when you are also seeing declines in other societal institutions that allow people to have strong relationships they can draw upon and then build on. In terms of what to do about it, I mean, that's really the tough problem here. I'm a free market kind of guy, and I worry about sort of socially engineering a better civil society. But there are things I think that we're currently doing which inadvertently can weaken some of these institutions. We have some pretty substantial marriage penalties, especially if we've done a good job of sort of getting single moms kind of working at least like part-time in order to qualify for these refundable tax credits and cash welfare, which has work requirements in some for some of them. But once you get into that sort of $15,000 to $20,000 earnings per year, there could be substantial penalties for getting married. You lose a lot of these benefits that we've provided. So I think we need to be careful in terms of certainly further expanding these benefits, because you're going to have to eventually take them away if you want to do any kind of targeting, which you need to do since we're in a fiscal trouble. So I think we need to worry about marriage penalties within our tax code and in our transfer programs. We also just need to make the cost of living lower. I think deregulation actually is a solution. It's not a full solution, but it's hard when it's so expensive to live in certain areas. One, because it's hard, that's where the jobs are and the higher wages are. That makes it harder to support a family. But it can also sort of drive families away. Like if the grandparents can't live near the kids because the parents are in a high cost area, that can be a barrier towards these strong institutions. I think there's also a cultural piece here, and people just need to talk about how important marriage is, and not be afraid to talk about the benefits for themselves, for the kids. So I think that would help. But yeah, I don't know. I don't have a great solution in terms of the work we're doing. I mean, we focused on certainly measuring it, which I think is a first step, documenting how it varies across the country. It's association with individual characteristics. So noting that it's really those with the lowest income who suffer from lower social capital. So I think that's a first step. But, I think the first step is just to figure out how existing policies are making it worse. And then I think it requires, things that are probably outside of government's purview to really make a big movement on it.
Kevin, there's a couple things you said that align really well with some things we've seen here in Utah. One, when you talk about marriage penalties, and just again for our listeners, that's one of the things we've specifically looked at, we've talked a lot about on this show, is in the social safety net. The question of, does getting married penalize you when it comes to the different government benefits you receive? And we here at Sutherland, we recently, just last year, conducted a survey and then released the findings, just asking statewide safety net participants in Utah if they had ever experienced benefits cliffs, and marriage penalties are part of that. And we found that about 9% of our respondents said at some point they had decided not to get married because they were worried about triggering some kind of benefit cliff of some form. And we talked with some folks in other states, did some focus groups in Georgia, to obviously seeing that this issue is national in scope. And so about 1 in 10 who have actually decided to turn down marriage because of the concern of what it would do to the safety net. It was less pronounced than other what I would call intentional earnings reductions, just kind of limiting their household income because they didn't want to trigger a benefit cliff. The total number, just for reference, was 43% of our respondents had at some point done something to say no to an opportunity related to work or marriage because of the concern for this. And again, about 1 in 10 with marriage specifically. So to your point, Kevin, that there may not be sort of a magic wand policy agenda, at least not yet, but there certainly could be some obstacles we can look at. I want to ask you about, you mentioned measuring the data as far as kind of how marriage affects things, two-parent households. There are a couple other threads as well where we've done some work here in Utah as well on the success sequence. We got the state legislature to pass a resolution basically kind of helping to orient state policy in that direction, taking the initial steps there. Is that, do you see any opportunities from a policy intervention standpoint there? And again, as a reminder for our listeners, the success sequence, the evidence showing that for young people who finish at least high school, get a full-time job, and then if they're going to have kids, marry first before having kids, folks who follow that kind of sequence, 97% roughly do not experience poverty in adulthood. So Kevin, when I hear that, I think, well, that's a solution. Is there some way to weave that into the public policy landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the data, right? Like, if you do those three things, you're unlikely to be in poverty, and you're just likely to be better off from sort of, if you incorporate sort of the social well-being and social capital dimension. And I think it's, great to push forth efforts to get that more into the public conversation. I don't think it's going to solve, right? We can say that that's important, but how do you actually get people to, one, stay in school, get a job, and then get married, and then have kids? I mean, that's, I think, the bigger challenge. So I'm happy that this is kind of being reemerging as like, these are fundamental things that we need to do. And I think it makes sense for state governments to say that, but I think it's only going to work if it really gets into the wider public consciousness. I typically don't care that much why I don't have a state, and I don't necessarily care what the DC government says about, moral messaging. So, not to say that it can't do it, but I think it really needs to infiltrate society more broadly, and that means it's not just coming from government, but it's kind of coming from people and I think that kind of gets to more of a bigger problem that we're seeing in society of this kind of the Charles Murray coming apart idea, that you have sort of these kind of elite group who has kind of followed the success sequence. They have high marriage rates. They don't have kids until they're married. They're doing very well economically. They're well educated, but they're sort of living apart from those who unfortunately have lower incomes. And there's this sort of economic segregation, and those are the ones that are not getting those messages, and they're the ones having lower marriage rates and more single parent births. And I think it's hard when these societies are kind of coming apart. And I go back to, if you want government solutions from public policy, I think the best thing, again, is deregulation. If you allow this sort of elite group to kind of seclude themselves by putting up these highly burdensome regulations on building housing and not having school choice, so that their kids are secluded in their own, publicly funded, but high quality schools, that's going to make it very hard to spread these messages through society. And if our only route is through government, I think that's not going to be nearly sufficient.
Kevin, we've got a few minutes left, but I want to kind of maybe talk forward-facing. This has been a great articulation of some of the challenges and maybe some different ways we can think about poverty and opportunity and upward mobility. And I really love the social capital angle being included as part of that, because I think you're absolutely right that it does not get discussed enough in these kinds of circles. As you think about, next steps as a country, as a state, the first question I want to ask is, obviously you folks at American Enterprise Institute and with the Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility, there's a strong focus on the national level, on things happening in Washington, D.C., and kind of nationally broadly. But are there things that you wish you would see more of from the states, from state-based policy organizations, from state-based policy leaders, whether it's governors or legislatures? What kinds of leadership do you think there needs to be more of from folks at the state level on all these topics, rather than solely kind of waiting on things to happen in Washington?
Yeah, so I guess maybe two things. I guess I'm a big fan of federalism, especially when it comes to safety net policies. I mean, I think there's a role for the federal government here. There's some incentive for localities to kind of not provide as much assistance in hopes that low-income people will move somewhere else. So I think there's a role for the federal government, but there's some huge benefits from states providing relief themselves. They're the ones that know their population. They probably have oftentimes better ideas than what people in Washington think. They can better cater assistance to the individuals that they know. And we, just from historical experience, some of the best things we've done and learned about in terms of the safety net have come from the states experimenting. In particular, the welfare reform that happened in the 1990s, where we kind of turned cash welfare from this kind of guaranteed assistance into one that required work and emphasized marriage. And we saw unprecedented success in promoting work, at least, and perhaps some leveling off of single parenthood. So we have seen success from states making these reforms. In some cases, you need approval from the federal government for waivers, and I hope this administration will provide those waivers. But I think just a willingness to lead and take risks. I mean, we need to have experience. I don't know exactly what's going to work. I tend to think we should have reforms that are going to promote work and marriage, but there's different ways of doing that, whether that's through requirements, time limits, which I think are actually a very underused tool, or other ways. I mean, I would love to see a lot more states taking initiative to try things. And, I think federal government should allow it. And then the other thing I think that states can do is tackling some of the regulations that just do really burden low-income families. By far, I think the most important is housing, but there's other areas too, like with occupational licensing, giving more opportunity for individuals to take on new types of careers without having to go through highly burdensome licensing procedures or having certain levels of credentials, and things like childcare, which is a very big expense for families and can be a barrier towards bigger and stronger families. So a lot of those regulations tend to be at the state or local level, and I think states can do a ton to lead on that as well.
Kevin, the last thing I want to ask you, and all of those, I mean, there's a lot of those conversations happening here in Utah, happening around the country. Housing, our governor, Spencer Cox, has said that, I think he said in one of his recent addresses, it might have been a State of the State, saying that housing is my first priority and my second priority and my third priority, just because in Utah in particular, housing costs have become a very serious constraint on household finances and upward mobility. But the federalism angle, I want to mention some of the things that we're doing here in Utah and kind of close with the question of how do we usher in more of this across the country from your vantage point in Washington. That here in Utah, we just concluded our legislative session, and one of the things that Sutherland Institute was actively involved in was securing funding from the TANF block grant to create a pilot program to address some of these benefits cliffs and the difficulties families face navigating the social safety net, to help them move more towards work. And so we're now in the process of kind of building that out, and I'll be executing that soon. And really the intent of the pilot program is to provide some kind of financial forecasting, planning resources so families can know with greater precision and accuracy what actually happens to my benefits as my earned income increases, so they can make informed decisions, whereas oftentimes right now they're making decisions out of fear. And also bring in enhanced kind of community-based coaching and mentoring. And this is kind of the social capital piece. nonprofit groups that do this. That's a little bit different of a kind of service than just maybe what a government agency would typically provide. So it's both sort of financial planning and forecasting and sort of building up that social capital. And then, of course, gathering robust data to identify where future reforms need to take place. To your point, largely with additional federal waiver authority. So kind of like we're trying to do what we can on the state level here within the existing authority that we have. But a lot of the things that we've been calling for do include that additional ability at the state level. Is there anything we can do as states, as a nation, to kind of usher in a new era of states being able to innovate across a wider array of these programs for reform? Any thoughts of how to prompt that?
Well, first I would say I think the combination of things that you're doing are exactly right. I'm an economist and I pay attention to incentives a lot. And I do think they matter a lot. We've seen that from previous policy changes. But these are human beings. And if you don't have the human element, the coaching aspect and helping people to be there to kind of hold them to account, but also to address their unique challenges, like I think you need both. And I think that's great that you're doing it. In terms of what we can do to forward that on, I mean, I think waivers are an extremely important tool from the federal government. To some extent, that's been happening with individual programs, like with the Medicaid waivers for work requirements that we saw in the first Trump administration. But I would like to see a lot more ability to consolidate programs together and try bigger things. It's just going to your point. I mean, these programs are pretty complicated and I don't think people understand them super well. And a lot of times their decisions are driven by fear. And that's almost a necessary byproduct of the way that our social safety net is created, because there's so many disparate programs run by different departments, but different goals. And they don't always work well together. So I would really like to see the ability of states to combine a lot of these programs and make bigger changes. Time limits, I think, are really underutilized aspect because we want a safety net that provides help when people need it, but we want to be able to transition people off. And when you pair that with sort of the coaching and the human touch, I think that could be very successful. So I think we just need to just basically what you guys are doing. But I would like to see, even broader relief in terms of all what you can bundle together, and then the types of reforms that can be tried, and so that we can learn from Utah and from all the different states on what's working. And not everything's going to universal. I mean, Utah's a pretty amazing state, number one in social capital in the country. So I don't think everything's going to generalize, but I think some lessons will, and other states should be trying things as well. And then I think we can get a smarter federal policy that takes some of those lessons, but still leaves the discretion for further experimentation.
Kevin, I have just one last question. We've taken a little extra time just because this is my favorite issue area, and I absolutely love hearing your insights about this. And I think it's very important for all of us around the country. The last question, kind of the magic wand question, if there was one big thing you could make happen tomorrow, in all the state houses around the country, in Washington, D.C., if all the governors or the president and congressional leadership came to you and said, we'll implement one big thing that you think we should do tomorrow, touching on anything within kind of the bailiwick of COSM, those three pillars, upward mobility, broadly speaking, what's the one big thing you wish would happen tomorrow if it were possible?
I would say I wouldn't want to do this with the federal government, but if I could wave a magic wand for state and local governments to not eliminate housing regulations, because you need some, but to make them way less burdensome, I think would do a ton of good on all of these dimensions. It would increase economic growth. It would reduce economic segregation, so we don't have as much of this coming apart society. It would increase upward mobility, because people who had lower wages could enter these places. It would actually help the environment because people wouldn't have to drive as far to work if you had more construction. So that would be my loftiest idea. I will give my second best, which is just a federal government thing. And that is just to pass Senator Lee's Houses Act, which this is a big problem in Utah and in the western part of the country. You have a lot of federal land and a lot of it's beautiful national parks, and you don't want to touch any of that. But you could take 0.1% of all federal land in the country. You could build 2.7 million homes with that and do a lot to alleviate the housing affordability crisis that we're facing. And that's something that Congress could do. It would actually raise money because you could sell the land to private developers, and you wouldn't even have to increase the density of existing neighborhoods. So to me, like if you can't do the super magical thing of changing all state and local government policies on regulations on housing immediately, I think something like that, where you could at least let people build on federal land and make some money doing it, would be a great step for states in the western part of the country.
Well, Kevin, we will wrap up there. Those are excellent. Again, housing is such an issue that's at the core of our challenges here in Utah as well as elsewhere. So I think that's a great kind of capstone for all this. And just really appreciative of you and the team at COSM and at AEI more broadly. We at Sutherland enjoy such a great, strong partnership with the folks at AEI. We've done a lot of great things together and will continue to do so. So really appreciative to you and your time and sharing your expertise with our audience here on Defending Ideas. We'll have to have you back again sometime soon.
That'd be great. Thanks, Nick.
Once again, that was Kevin Corinth, Deputy Director for the Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility, the American Enterprise Institute, where he's also a Senior Fellow. We're going to take a quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back. There are two themes that I want to emphasize from our conversation with Kevin that I think should shape the way you and I talk about poverty and opportunity. First, poverty is not just about not having enough. If it were, then the calls for more generous government programs that simply give people greater financial resources could make sense. But I think we need to think of poverty more in terms of barriers to being able to earn enough. In this way, addressing poverty is really less about simply alleviating material hardship, though it's important that our safety net does that effectively and efficiently in a limited and targeted way, and more about helping families along a trajectory of upward mobility that leads them to work-based self-reliance. This framing will help guide the way we think about poverty and opportunity, as well as the kinds of reforms we pursue. Second, Kevin made this really great point that social capital needs to be an essential part of our efforts to improve opportunity and social mobility in this country. The American dream is about much more than just earning a solid, steady paycheck, though that's an essential part of it. It's also about connection through family, faith communities, free association with civic groups and neighbors, and more. Our efforts to empower fellow Americans who struggle should not be limited to only the material. Bolstering the civic institutions of faith, family, free enterprise, and more will go a long way in helping all Americans enjoy the blessings of the full promise of America. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your shows. And please share this episode on your own social media profiles, or with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it interesting. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.